Hi, everyone. Good evening. I am so happy to welcome you to this evening's program. My name is Dali Torn, and I'm the Executive Director at the Vilna Shoal Boston Center for Jewish Culture. The Vilna is located on historic Beacon Hill and is the last remaining immigrant-era synagogue in Boston. Today, we are a center for engagement, a center for arts and culture, and a space to house programs like this for big ideas by great minds in our community. Tonight, we are thrilled to be hosting Batya-Ungar Sargon, the Deputy Opinion Editor of Newsweek, who's going to join us to discuss her book, Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. She has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Newsweek, the New York Review of Books, Daily, and several other publications. And we are thrilled to be welcoming her to the Vilna this evening. Before we get started, I just want to go over a couple of quick housekeeping announcements. The first is that tonight's program will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel and shared with everybody who registered for this program soon. The second is that due to the large number of people in this program, we're going to ask that everyone keep themselves on mute, and that if you have a question that you would like to ask of Batya, that you type it into the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen. We really want to hear from you, and about 35 minutes into the program, we will begin a Q&A with Batya. So please do share your questions as soon as you have one, put it in, and I am excited to ask it of you. And lastly, the program this evening should be about 60 minutes, so we'll probably wrap up just shortly after 8 o'clock. And without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Batya-Ungar Sargon.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm really, really honored to be speaking to you. Thank you so much, Dalit and Olga, for setting this up. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I know that my book and my talk are provocative. The last time I spoke at a reform shul, the audience did not like the talk, but afterwards, when I got off the stage, the two Hispanic police officers who had been assigned to my detail looked at me and said, "Well, you sold 2 books," even though I was really harsh on the police. So take that as you will. And I'm really only going to talk for about 35 minutes because I do really want to hear your comments and hear from you and hear your questions and your reactions. Okay. So the main point that I'm going to be making is that a lot of what we think about as political debates or culture wars are actually conversations that are about class, or rather that are conversations that are hiding a conversation or a truth about class. And that's really what my book is about. The truth is that there has emerged in America an enormous class chasm between people with a college degree on the one hand and people without one. People with a college degree have managed to amass to the tune of $23 trillion over the last 2 years in America, over and above people without a college degree. Those with a college degree are doing really, really well, and those without a college degree are downwardly mobile. Their health is worse, they make a lot less money, and their children's futures are bleak. And it is my view that a lot of the debates we're having about Donald Trump, about Black Lives Matter, about Canadian truckers, even about things like transgender issues, are actually hiding this class divide because the people who are in charge of what we discuss are benefiting from the class divide. They're sort of at the top. They have a college degree. I'm going to talk specifically about the media, about the leftist media. That's what my book is really about. As a person who is of the left and on the left, that's really what I care about. That's what my focus is. And then right at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit about how this impacts the conversations we're having in and about the Jewish community. So let's start with journalists. Back in 2016, journalists, Democratic politicians, and never Trumpers struggling to comprehend how anybody could have supported a candidate like Donald Trump, they came up with really 2 competing explanations. So one camp argued that it was a protest vote stemming from the economic anxiety and despair birthed by globalization, stagnant working class wages, and downward mobility for the shrinking middle class. The other camp argued that Trump's supporters were, well, racists. Trump's opponent in the race, Hillary Clinton, was actually the rare person who had both of those views. They were immortalized in her infamous basket of deplorables comment, right? You remember she said, you could put half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables, the racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. Clinton said, but that other basket of people are people who feel the government has let them down. The economy has let them down. Nobody cares about them. Nobody worries about what happens to their lives and their futures. And they're just desperate for change. That was the Clinton quote. So you can imagine a world in which after Clinton lost the election, a loss not unrelated to having made those comments, liberals would question the efficacy, if not the morality, of calling a quarter of the country racist, right? Half of Trump's voters, the way she put it. But instead, as you already know, they doubled down. It wasn't just a quarter of the nation who was racist. It wasn't just half of Trump's voters. It was all of them. It was half the nation. Everyone who voted for him was racist. By 2017, the very term economic anxiety had been branded a dog whistle for racism by some of the highest profile journalists in the country. The New York Times, in the run-up to the 2020 election, an election that the New York Times told us every single day was the most important election of our lifetimes, the Times did not run a single op-ed by somebody who was planning to vote for Trump explaining why. Not one. So 72 million Americans had been deemed, their views had been deemed outside the mainstream because they were voting for the wrong person. Even if you don't like him, right, you can, like, it's so obvious we should understand why people were voting for him, right? Why they liked him. No, that view was verboten. It became taboo. How did this happen? How did the intelligentsia of our day, the journalists and thinkers and influencers and professional tweeters who set the agenda for the nation, unfortunately, people who are on the left, how did they allow themselves to police out of existence in polite society the devastating effects of globalization on the middle class and the working class of all races, by the way? How did we allow the definition of racism to melt until it covered people, again, of all races, who had voted for Donald Trump? And you saw this in the New York Times after the 2020 election, where Charles Blow, one of the columnists there, he said any person who voted for Trump was a white supremacist, including Black and Hispanic people who voted for Donald Trump. They're also white supremacists. So, a lot of these people were voting for Trump because the economy was actually working for them. In 2016, the number one predictor for whether a county would go for Trump was how many deaths of despair had happened in that county. And in 2020, in communities of color, Trump gained a lot of ground. And the number one predictor was whether or not those people of color had a college degree. The bottom 25% of wage earners in 2019 saw a 4.5% wage increase, which was unheard of in American history for the bottom to see that kind of growth. And maybe you didn't know about that. And it's not your fault that you didn't know about that, because the media refused to cover it. The Republicans are not interested in the working class and their good fortunes. And the Democrats didn't want to say anything nice about Trump. And so literally the Trump economy was we didn't talk about it at all. And maybe you didn't know that 2019 saw historic lows in Black unemployment. Maybe you don't know that Republicans have been at the forefront of criminal justice reform for over a decade. I don't know. A lot of liberals don't know this. They don't know that Trump released 5,000 Black men from prison. People just don't know that. And I think it's really important that we ask ourselves, why don't we know that? Like, why don't we know that? That seems important, relevant to communities, to people like me who care a lot about criminal justice, who care a lot about racism in sentencing, who think that the criminal justice system is deeply racist in many ways. It sort of matters that, one president released 5,000 Black men from prison, men who were put there by the guy that we have now, by the way, right? By Joe Biden's crime bill. It's interesting, right? Of course, it's not just Trump. So, you see this divide on many, many issues. And I think that it's just, we've lost not just the ability to see these things because the media doesn't tell us about them, but we've really lost the ability to ask even the right questions about things. And I think that a lot of this has to do with something that we call wokeness. Now, I can already feel like people having resistance to that word. And I just want to be very clear about what I do mean by the word woke and what I don't mean by the word woke. So the word woke is in my title. It's the word woke comes from Black slang. It used to refer to, in the 70s, in the 80s, something that I think is extremely important, which is being aware of exactly what I was just describing, systemic inequities against people of color that are imposed by the state. When I use it now, I am using it to refer to something that sociologists have started to notice, which is something that is, it's sort of a little bit ephemeral, but they noticed that white liberals have become more extreme in their views on race than Black and Hispanic Americans. What does that mean, more extreme? So when you ask people, when you propose the following sentence to them, this is what Pew did. They said to people, they proposed the sentence, this following sentence. America's institutions are so deeply racist that they all need to be razed to the ground and rebuilt from the ground up. Right? Do you agree or disagree with that statement? So it turns out that there's only one group of Americans who agree with that statement by over 90%. You might think that it is the people who suffer from racism in America, like Black Americans would be overwhelmingly likely to say yes to that. But it's actually the only group that said yes to that America's institutions are so deeply racist that they have to be destroyed and rebuilt from the ground up. The only group that said yes to that were progressives. And the progressives, the group of people who make up America's progressives, are 6% of Americans. And it is the whitest of all of the subgroups in the Democratic Party, the whitest, the most affluent, and the most highly educated. Those are the people who have that view. That's what I mean when I say that they overtook Black and Hispanic Americans in the extremity of their views on racism and on race. So consider another piece of evidence. You know, this is something that had a really deep impact on me that I didn't know. And when I learned about it, it was sort of a game changer for me. And I'm very interested to know if any of you have heard about this. There was a Yale study conducted in 2018, and it found that there's a difference between how white liberals and white conservatives talk to Black and Latino Americans. So if you had said that to me and you didn't tell me what the difference was, I would have said, you know, back when I was woke, I would have said, well, obviously, like the Republicans are the racist ones, right? And the liberals are, you know, the non-racist ones who care about people of color. So the difference is probably they're nicer, whatever it is, right? So here's the difference. The Yale professors found that white liberals, when they talk to Black and Hispanic Americans, they dumb down their vocabulary. They literally dumb down their vocabulary. They use smaller words than when they talk to other white people. And white conservatives don't do this. So here's a quote from the study. Most whites, particularly sociopolitical liberals, now endorse racial equality. Archival and experimental research reveals a subtle but reliable ironic consequence. White liberals self-present less competence to minorities than other whites. That is, they patronize minorities who they stereotype as lower status and less competent. So just think about that for a minute. When white liberals encounter a Black person or a Hispanic person, they immediately stereotype them as being lower status. And so they start to use smaller words. And white conservatives don't do this. By the way, when I told, you know, I have a number of very, very close friends who are people of color. And when I told them this, their first reaction was, oh, yeah, we all know that. Like they were not surprised by this, right? We all know that. Like, yeah, that's what it means to be progressive. That's what it means to be woke. It's true. It used to refer to something really important, but now what it refers to in the sociological discourse is this phenomenon. The thing that makes white liberals dumb down their speech when they're talking to people of color. They do this out of a misplaced desire to be good. Like they think this is how you help, but it reveals this patronizing point of view, this like really dark, sick way of thinking about people as being beneath you somehow and needing your help. I mean, that's the nugget, is the needing of your help. So I remember when I first learned about this study, I was really woke, and I was totally horrified because I knew that it was an indictment of my whole worldview, and I couldn't handle it. I took the study and I put it in a drawer. I remember exactly where I was sitting. I closed the drawer and I said, I'll come back to this in 3 months because I know I'm going to lose all my friends over this. And I did. All right. So I think that this is what I'm referring to when I use the word woke, and what increasingly sociologists are talking about when they talk about the Great Awakening. They're talking about a worldview that divides people into categories by race, white versus people of color, and then ascribes power and privilege to one side of that binary and powerlessness and marginalization to the other, and then says all virtue belongs to the oppressed. It's the idea of race not to defend people who need it, but to achieve power. That's how Shelby Steele talks about this. So, when I say woke, I'm not talking about making an end to mass incarceration or education reform. Those things are really important. We desperately need police reform. That's obviously something that even Republicans don't disagree with anymore. So I think that, a lot of the battles about racism, police brutality, and mass incarceration are over, actually. They've been won by the left. Senator Tim Scott is a Republican, a Black Republican in South Carolina. He was the last person to put forward a piece of police reform legislation, and it was blocked by the Democrats. Over the last 10 years, you've seen in places like Idaho and Georgia, deeply red states that have overseen just thousands of prisoner releases. Not because they believe in racial justice necessarily, but because they believe in, they're Christian, they believe in a second chance, and from fiscal reasons, right? But again, like, there's no real divide over these issues anymore. But instead of the left recognizing this and saying, wow, we don't have a fight over these things anymore, progressives moved the goalposts. They redefined what it means to be racist. So, across the nation, as Americans finally came around to agree with Dr. King with this idea that we have to strive for a world in which, we are all judged equally based on our character and on our skin color, the left turned around and called that view, the desire to live in a colorblind society, that's now considered racist by people on the left. When the right finally recognized the need for police reform, the left branded police reform not enough and racist because it fell short of defunding the police, right? That became the clarion call. And meanwhile, 81% of Black Americans oppose defunding the police. So when Gallup asked Black Americans, do you want the police to spend more time in your neighborhood, less time in your neighborhood, or the same amount of time, 81% said they want the police to spend the same amount of time or more in their neighborhoods. You're in woke territory when the policy that you're pushing in the name of Black Americans is opposed by 81% of Black Americans, but it's the only view you can read in the New York Times. And it's not just policing. Instead of education reform, we're told that standardized testing is white supremacist. And, we're told that the filibuster is white supremacist. And we're told it's racist to vote for Glenn Youngkin, even though he got 50% of Latinos and record numbers of Black moms. It's not about fighting racism. This is about wokeness. It's about power. And it's not actually even about race or politics. It's actually about class. And the reason that I mean that it's about class is exactly for this reason that I've been describing. Who has these ideas? You get these ideas by being white and by being overeducated, by having gone to a very fancy school and picking up this language. So my dad's British, and in England, they have these accents. You could tell by somebody's accent in England within 20 miles of where they were born, and with reasonable certainty how much money their father makes. That accent really marks their class position in a very strict hierarchy. So in America, we don't have accents. We do have accents, but we don't have accents that correlate with income or with class and status. We have words like Latinx, which is a word that progressives use to talk about Hispanics that is used by 3% of Hispanics to talk about themselves. So why do white progressives use that word? Because it signals their class belonging. It signals, just like that belief that, America's institutions are so deeply racist that they have to be razed to the ground and rebuilt from the ground up. That view signals your class belonging because it suggests that you've had a college education, by and large, because nobody without a college education would think anything that ridiculous, which is why Black people don't think that, because it's absolutely ridiculous. It's these progressives, the 6% of Americans who have the most woke views on race, that extremity of those views, the point I'm trying to make is, it doesn't reflect the reality on the ground. So why do they believe it? They believe it because the class that they want to belong to believes that that's how you signal that belonging in that class. And you get to that class by getting this college education, going to university, increasingly expensive universities that are filled with other overeducated, meritocratic elites. So how did this happen? How did white liberals become more extreme in their views on race than Black and Hispanic Americans? That's really what my book is about. So it tells the story of how that happened. And I found something surprising, which is that all of this talk about race is about class. It's about an affluent progressive elite distracting from the class conversation and from the ways that it has benefited from a class chasm in America. So 40, 50 years ago, the left was on the side of the working class. The Democrats were the party of labor. And even 20 or 30 years ago, journalists and college professors, people in the intelligentsia, they just did not make that much more money than working class Americans. Back in the 70s, throughout the 20th century, journalism was a working class trade. But even more recently, the class divide was not this stark. But as journalism and academia collapsed as industries, they squeezed those in the middle to the top 10% in terms of income, and then they dropped everybody out who didn't make it. And so today, America's intelligentsia is very affluent. We've become what the French economist Thomas Piketty calls a Brahmin left, after the highest class in Hindu society, the priests, who are known as Brahmins. And that's really who American media, especially American liberal media, is being produced for. Everything that the progressive left, if you look at the list of their priorities, it all comes at the expense of the working class. It's stuff that sounds like social justice, but actually somebody is paying for it, and it's working class Americans. You're dealing with Brahmin leftism and not labor leftism when a topic takes up a lot of time on our airwaves and gets a lot of play from the squad, but it demands no real sacrifice from highly educated, affluent elites. The opposite, it furthers their economic goals at the expense of the working class of all races, by the way. So, for example, diversity, equity, and inclusion seminars, or open borders, or banning fracking, or defunding the police, or forgiving $50,000 in student loans. Like, who has $50,000 in student loans? Doctors, lawyers, professors, film study majors, journalists, people who just got that $23 trillion, at a time of really increased inflation that's really crushing the working class. So the Great Awakening is really the calling card of this Brahmin leftism. And it's a fringe ideology, 6% of Americans. So why do we feel like this is like everybody thinks this? Why do we feel like everybody believes, agreed with this defund the police view? It's really because of the media. The national mainstream news media has played a really crucial role in pushing Brahmin leftism. For a long time, the idea that America is an unrepentant white supremacy that confers power and privilege on white people, that it systematically denies to people of color, was a view that you only found among far-left activists and academics. But over the past decade, it's found its way into the mainstream largely through liberal media outlets like the New York Times, NPR, MSNBC, the Washington Post, Vox, CNN, the New Republic, the Atlantic. These used to be distinct publications. Like, they each had their own audience, they each had their own tone, right? Their own perspective on the world. Today, they are all totally uniform. I mean, you read an article, you can't, it could be from any of these outlets. They're all identical. There's a moral panic around race everywhere, and they are all running articles. And here's just a sampling of some headlines. Is the white church inherently racist? The housewives of white supremacy. When Black people are in pain, white people just join book clubs. How white women use themselves as instruments of terror. Like, this is the bread and butter of the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN now. So we often think about this obsession as stemming from the election of Donald Trump, who was, so extreme in his disregard of liberal mores and so willing to offend with comments that were actually sometimes racist, that the liberal media swung hard to the left. There's definitely truth to that. The mainstream media definitely molded itself around Trump. His presidency was a major gift to MSNBC and CNN and the New York Times. A lot of outlets were struggling. He showed up and they were doing super well for a while. They're not doing so well anymore. But I think that Trump is really an insufficient answer, because the moral panic that's been mainstreamed by the liberal news media had actually been underway for about 5 years before Trump appeared on the scene. And again, you don't have to rely on my impressions. Everything I'm saying here, literally everything I'm saying here, every number that comes out of my mouth is in the book, is sourced to Gallup or to the Pew Research Center or to the sociologists, multiple sociologists tracking this stuff. So what they found was that starting in 2011, articles mentioning the words racism, people of color, slavery, oppression started to appear, like they were like this, and then like with exponential frequency, just all the time at the New York Times and BuzzFeed and Vox and the Washington Post and NPR. I think it's been really hard to miss this. Like, I can remember 10, 15 years ago when like you could open the New York Times and, not read articles about, slavery for like, months at a time, but now you really can't. And, but you don't have to rely on my impressions or your impressions, because like I said, sociologists have been really trawling the archives for this. So they've looked at the archives, for example, at the New York Times from 1970 to 2018. And what they found was that the frequency of words like racism and white supremacy and KKK and traumatizing and marginalized and hate speech and intersectionality and activism had just like totally skyrocketed. So for example, the term white supremacy was used fewer than 75 times in the Washington Post and the New York Times, but over 700 times in 2020 alone. At NPR, it was used 2,400 times. The word racism appeared in the Washington Post over 4,000 times in 2020. That's the equivalent of 10 articles every single day. So you might say, well, white supremacy is on the rise. I mean, a little bit on the margins of society, yeah, but not to justify that. That is totally out of step with, I mean, you just talk to anybody, totally out of step with not just people's experience, Black people's experience, but with the data that shows that Americans are getting radically less racist with every year. So as Americans are getting radically less racist by every measure that we have, the incidence, it's like this, the incidence of talking about it in the mainstream media has skyrocketed. So this looks like it's a story about race, but again, this story is about class. Here's why. Throughout the 20th century, American journalists underwent a status revolution. Journalism went from being a working class trade to a highly educated caste. And this is what my book is about. American journalism was born in the 19th century of a populist revolution in the form of the penny press, which was explicitly produced for and by the laboring class. And these papers made the masses unignorable because they took up their causes. And this is no longer the case. 92% of American journalists have a college degree. The vast majority of them have a graduate degree. College itself is not enough to become a journalist today. And again, this is based on data in the book. You have to go to the best colleges. You have to take unpaid internships in the most expensive American cities where most journalists live. 75% of journalists live in the most expensive American cities. And like other highly educated, liberals, they've become increasingly affluent. So the starting salary of a digital media job is about $35,000 a year. So let me tell you, you cannot live on that in New York City. That means that somebody else is paying your rent, basically. And as journalists became part of the elites, they abandoned the working class to which they once belonged, and they began instead to obsess over race in what I argue is a great exercise in distraction from the absolutely appalling levels of income inequality in America and the great class chasm that skyrocketed them to the top. Instead of bringing this chasm to the fore, journalists instead shifted to race. but not in a way that people of color would recognize. They brought an academic framework based on critical race theory with them out of their elite universities and into newsrooms that are overwhelmingly white. Again, for reasons of class, because you have to be rich to become a journalist today. And unfortunately, America's rich are very white. Of course, it's not all the fault of individual journalists. Issues of identity wouldn't be dominating our newspapers and airwaves if there wasn't a profit motive at stake. And I talk a lot about this in the book, why the corporate business model of journalism rewards being more and more extreme as opposed to trying to get the broadest possible audience. And that's only amped up in the digital media age to where you can really tailor your content for the income level of your readership. And the reason that there's no difference now between the Atlantic and the New York Times and CNN and MSNBC and the Washington Post is because everybody, you remember I said there's like only 6% of Americans are progressives and they're very affluent and overeducated and living on the coasts. All these outlets want that same 8-10 million readers and nobody else. They're not interested in any other readers. And I go into at length in the book why that is. So if publications once had an incentive to cater to the widest possible readership, today many of them operate in fear of it upsetting their most extreme readers and viewers. And while the far left in America was once defined by economic concerns for the less fortunate, today it's defined by issues of identity that work well to mask the way that the left has benefited from the inequality birthed of this class chasm that has skyrocketed the fortunes of the college educated. In other words, as journalists became part of the elite, they abandoned the working class to wage a culture war around race that disguised the ways in which they have benefited from inequality. So, and here's, I'm coming to the end. I just want to talk a little bit about what this has to do with Jews. You know, I'm one of these people who, I'm not an alarmist about anti-Semitism. I don't think that Jews are the biggest you know, wokeness roadkill. It's definitely the working class of all races. It's you know, the Black working class most of all, because whatever bad happens, they get the worst of it. You know, so I don't think in any way that Jews are paying the price, you know, and we're very, thank God, like we're quite economically secure as a community in this country. And the working class is very pro-Jewish. Like we're just, you know, a lot of people, you're often hearing from people talking about how, you know, America's becoming like Europe when it comes to Jews. I don't buy any of that. I think that's a moral panic because there's just no buy-in from the working class in America for anything that has to do with anti-Semitism or even anti-Zionism. America's working class is deeply, deeply Zionist because they're very Christian, very religious. Put simply, I think we are the luckiest Jews to ever walk planet Earth. And I think that that's a really important thing to stress. Now, at the same time, any worldview that reifies race or obsesses over race or divides people into a binary or categorizes people based on race is going to be bad for Jews. And the anti-racist worldview of Ibrahim X. Kendi and critical race theory is very much about prioritizing race over everything else. And what ends up happening is Jews get put into the white category. And as a result, nobody will stand up for them, even when, you know, Orthodox Jews, hundreds of Orthodox Jews are beaten up in the streets of New York City. No one will talk about it because it doesn't fit into the woke binary because, you know, the Jews are the oppressors because they're white. So nobody can talk about it and nobody will do anything about it. And I think, you know, moreover, anti-Zionism, I think, has become the latest plank in that Brahmin leftist platform, the latest elite university cooked up out of touch nonsense that's being pushed by people like the Squad and their acolytes. So you saw this last May when there was a conflagration between Israel and Hamas. And in the pages of like major publications and from celebrities and actors and musicians and models and members of Congress, you saw this unmistakable shift in rhetoric around Israel and Zionists, where it became completely normal to talk about Zionism as an ideology of hate and Israel as a genocidal apartheid and American Jews who support Israel as like totally fair game. And there was actually pogroms, like people just hunting down Jews in the streets of major liberal American cities. And obviously like nobody stood up for them. You know, of course, there have always been views on the far left denouncing Israel as an apartheid and calling Zionists racist. But now that view is really mainstream. You'll see it in the Washington Post. You'll see it in MSNBC. You see, of course, in the New York Times. And so just as in America, where the Anti-Racist Project redefined racism and relocated the problem to where it costs the least for white liberal elites to, do the work. This happened in the case of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where real and urgent civil rights abuses against Palestinians have been obscured by a binary maximalist anti-Zionist view of the situation that's now fully mainstream. So just as, defund the police is so popular in Park Slope and opposed by 81% of Americans, Black Americans, so too does the woke moral panic that now encompasses Israel do little to actually help Palestinians deprived of civil rights, which is, like police reform, an urgent cause of our time. The good news is that Americans remain overwhelmingly immune to the leftist malarkey about Israel. The data shows that Americans are still overwhelmingly pro-Israel, despite the fact that their national news media is working overtime to change that. Minorities, too, are completely, it's just not the case. Like what you hear, this moral panic, they're turning against Jews, turning against Israel. It's really not happening. What we see again is that class is the issue. So the number one predictor for whether you support the Palestinians over Israel is whether or not you have a college degree. Again, that's from Pew. People with a high school diploma or less are the least likely to support the Palestinians, second only to white evangelicals, and followed closely by Black Americans. So this is why I'm not in a panic about anti-Semitism coming to America. I think our leftist elites and our far right, they exist. They don't like Israel and they don't like Jews, and it doesn't matter because they're very limited in scope and in how much influence they can have, because they're so out of touch and so disconnected from the communities they pretend to represent. So it is, again, race, not class, a class, not race, and not partisanship that is driving this new language around Israel. And it's very circumscribed to these sort of highly educated liberal elites. The sad thing is, and I'm just going to close with this because I'm anxious to hear what you guys think. The sad thing is that while most Americans see this for the nonsense that it is, many liberal American Jews have fallen prey to it. There is a huge crisis in moral authority in the Jewish community. So many Jews that I speak to or I see, talking, writing things I hear from, they've simply ceded their right to decipher right from wrong to anyone who they view as in the oppressed side of the woke binary. Too many Jews have fallen into this trap, and now they'll say things like that, our community is upholding white supremacy and other just disgusting things like that. 25% of American Jews, I think something like that, think Israel is an apartheid or some crazy thing like that. We have to fight this, and not even mostly on our own behalf. We have to fight it for the reason American Jews have always fought for equality and justice for all Americans, especially poor and working class Black and Hispanic and white Americans, those who have lost out in the economy that's working for us. In other words, American Jews should be opposed to wokeness, not because we're Jews, but because we are American. And we do this by refusing to let the media and our politicians divide us, by insisting on the truth that more unites us as Americans than divides us, and by pushing with every fiber of our beings to make this a more perfect union. So thank you so much. That's what, I came to say. And now I'm excited to have the Q&A portion.
Batya, thank you so much. So much of what you said was provocative, which is not new news to you, no pun intended. And also really thoughtful, and your passion is just like shooting off of the screen. So thank you for being here with us. I have so many questions, and there are also many questions from others. So I want to start with this. You spent a lot of time focusing on progressives, and there were a couple of questions in the chat or in the Q&A about, really teasing out progressives as opposed to, and I'm gonna, maybe get categories wrong here, but as opposed to liberals or Democrats, or basically like, what are all the people who are not part of the 6% that you're speaking about right now? Because I think there's an understanding that when someone has access to power, right, the 6%, that they also have all sorts of microphones where they can amplify their voice. But, you compare it to positions of middle class, but can you tell us a little bit about some of those other groups who might vote along the same lines, who might even have elected officials, who might be part of the squad, et cetera, but tell us about the people who aren't the 6%, And to help like unpack this for us, both their positions, their opinions, and maybe what threats they might be under too.
That's such a great question. So I can't recall like immediately to mind that, but there's each, so Pew divided America into, I think it was about 10 groups. So 5 on the left and 5 on the right. And on the left, so like I said, the 6%, you know, that was the progressives. But, you know, one of the largest groups was the group that had the most Black Americans in it, which was like moderate Democrats. So they always vote for Democrats. I mean, 90% of the Black community pretty much votes for Democrats pretty consistently. But they're very conservative socially. And you know, 2/3 of Black Americans, if you ask them, will say that they will either call themselves conservative or moderate. They will not call themselves liberal. And so, but they're Democrats, right? They're solidly in the Democratic category. You know, so they are divided across 2 or 3 of the sort of more moderate, like closer to the center Democratic groups. And their views are just so different from the people who are in fact, a lot of their social views are much more similar to people on the right side of the category. And I think you're seeing a lot of that with Hispanics now too. Hispanics again it's very regional actually. So Hispanics living in Texas, ironically, tend to be much more enticed by the conservative position by the Republican Party, because they are very much suffering from the open border situation. Their immigration is no longer a number one concern for Hispanics. It's their number one concern is inflation and jobs. But you know, the Hispanics in California tend to be a lot more aligned with the Democratic Party, a lot more aligned with progressives. Bernie Sanders did super well with Hispanics in Nevada. So you know, the categories we're used to thinking about, they're a little bit too neat for the real ideological diversity that is in these communities. And even you know, in the, you know, among the liberal community, if you know, people who are watching who find them, who say, look, I vote for a Democrat, but I find myself more moderate, more to the center. I don't really relate to this kind of critical race theory, you know, whatever, you know, debates. They are much more similar to your median, your average Black and Hispanic voter than are the, you know, people who vote for the Squad, for example.
Great. There's a couple of questions about, so like, what do we do with what you're saying, right? And the way that people are asking the question is, some people are saying, so where do we get our news if we don't want to be indoctrinated?
Yeah.
And I'll actually start there, and then I have a couple follow-up.
It's a really good question. I personally think that we get too much news and we care too much about the news. I think that Americans have abandoned a sense of spirituality and community, and we've replaced it with information and knowledge, because we only know how to value, like, you know, knowledge industry jobs, and we only know how to value like meritocracy, and we only know how to value smart people and talented people. We've lost the ability to see the world in a more sort of commonsensical communal way, where the thing that binds you with somebody is not necessarily that they're the most fascinating person you ever met, but just the fact that you're in community with them. And so I really feel like we should all be consuming much less news. And I'm very happy to see that we are. I mean, there's a mass consumer boycott of the news going on right now among Americans. So I think that's really good. Just consume less of it is always like, there's nothing in the New York Times that matters to your life that you can't get from walking down to the local bodega and just talking to the local bodega owner, like going to church, going to shul, like going to volunteer. Like there's nothing that somebody who has a national platform can tell you that actually matters to your life. Like, just give you the most recent example. Like, nobody asked us if we wanted to give $14 billion to Ukraine. I mean, maybe we would have said yes, but there was no referendum on that. There was no vote on that. And that's everything now. They do everything. They don't care what you think. And so to me, it's just like the idea that we need to be somehow informed on a day-to-day basis in every minute of I just think we're consuming too much of it. But if people like push me against all day, what do you watch? So I part of my job, because I'm an opinion, I have to watch the conversation unfold. And so I watch CNN and Fox all day. And then there are some YouTube shows I really like. I recommend Breaking Points on YouTube. It's a great show. It's a right-wing populist and a left-wing populist, and they're just so smart. I really respect them. And I have to say, like, I've never seen the Wall Street Journal get something intentionally wrong, or sensationalize something. I used to be a New York Times girl, and now I get the Wall Street Journal, and it makes me feel poor because it's for rich people, but they're the ones who I still feel sort of like are really trying their best to hew to what we used to consider to be the standard. But again, there's a lot in there that's totally irrelevant to my life, and there's a lot that's not in there that would be like I just feel like we should all take a step back and be like, you know, it's so irrelevant, like it's so meaningless, and it's making us hate our fellow Americans. So that's another thing I would say is like, what can we do with this information? So I didn't talk a lot about this, but like news right now is very much getting filtered through digital tools, through digital media, and through social media. So when we're assigning things as journalists, when we're writing things as journalists, we're thinking, how's this going to play on Twitter? And the thing about social media is that they've hacked our souls. And so like the point of social media, the point of everything that comes out of Silicon Valley is to make you the product, right? If something's free and you're using it, you're the product. But it's not just to sell you ads. It's really, it's the outrage game. Like they make, the more emotional you are when you're on an app, the longer you stay on the page and the more money they make, which means that every time you see something on your phone that makes you feel like enraged, someone just made $1 million off of you. Like, and I'm not exaggerating. Like that's the whole Silicon Valley model is based on that. And the news is now indebted to that model. And you can literally deprive them of that paycheck by saying, I'm going to refuse to hate my fellow American. Like I'm going to refuse to let someone else make money off of making me hate a Republican. Like it's not natural to hate a stranger that much.
Yeah. So there's a really good question here that I was also thinking about, which is when you're speaking about, isn't it true that much of the progressive agenda is designed to move the so-called middle America rather than wanting their agenda to become policy? And so the question is really like, from what you're saying, isn't it working?
But it's to move them where? Like it is. It's to move them to things like forgiving $50,000 in student loans, which Biden is getting immense pressure to do. It's like a bailout for the richest Americans. It's so crazy, but it is.
Let me actually restate part of it, which is, I think that, the question also here is like, do you believe that there's a certain kind of intentionality behind some of the progressive agenda that means well, even if it might be disconnected perhaps from reality, because there might be this lack of connection or awareness of someone else's experience, but there's an effort here to raise up and lift up perhaps marginalized voices, people who might not have that kind of access. And so the question is, even if the progressives are getting it wrong, are they, and even what they're doing might be wrong. The question is it working that they're trying to do it? And so what do you do with that?
I 100% think it's all totally sincere. Like I really do think that. I think it's very clear that they have good intentions. In fact, Yuval Levin has this great quote. He said, Washington would be a much easier place to change and navigate if everybody who showed up was like, hey, I'm going to get all the money and all the power. And instead everybody shows up and is like, I'm going to fix the world. And that's so much harder to. But if you think of them as going, you'll never change them. And I'm totally committed, even if this is Pollyannish and naive, I'm totally committed to the view that progressives are doing this out of a desire to heal the world and lift up the marginalized. However, I don't think they would be making such an egregious error if it wasn't benefiting them economically. So I think it's intertwined. I think at an unconscious level, I think you meet people who live in Park Slope. I'm sure you know people like this, and their combined income is $400,000 a year, and they feel poor. And they're not lying. Like they actually don't have a lot of, discretionary income because their rent is astronomical and they're sending their kids to private school and paying, $50,000 a head for these private schools. So they feel poor and they feel really sorry for them. I don't doubt that they really feel poor, but so much of the energy around the progressive movement is for them. Like everything is to cater to them, to allow them to keep making $400,000 a year, keep feeling poor, keep living at a standard that is so astronomically above like the average American. And then they want to feel like the social justice heroes. So like, I know, I sound like I think it's cynical and I really don't. But I think that we have, it's so, we're living like basically in an oligarchy at this point. Like the elites have all of the political power. They have, 60% of the GDP belongs to the top 10%, and of course they love to rail against the 1%, right? Like, oh, the 1%, right? But I do think that they mean well. And so I am trying, and I was very gratified. The book was very much received as a left-wing critique. Obviously, I'm very popular in right-wing circles where I spread my Marxism, just like I spread it here. I'm always telling them to be more Marxist, but it was received as a left-wing critique, which is how I intended it.
Great. I have a question. I want to shift from talking about class for a moment to talking about age groups for different people, basically demographics. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit about different generations? I'm thinking a lot about younger generations. I feel, which I am no longer of, so I'm going to talk about people who are, what I see out there is that many people are really becoming visual learners. People are taking things in, on Instagram and other places. They are not even reading an article, but it's not because of the sophisticated critiques that you're making. It's because people don't have the bandwidth or all the other reasons why, like when they're scrolling on their phone, they're just, I don't have to tell you about this. And so the question is really, is your primary concern right now about how the 6% who are self-identifying as progressives are controlling the media, period? That's the biggest issue, out there. Or, what do you think about the next generation and how they're either accessing or interested and engaged with world events, local events, where they're getting their media? How is that going to play in as there's like the part two to this conversation? And I'll add into the question, really the educated folks who are in college today. Do you find that those people who would be the next generation of progressives, that they're going to be contributing to the same kind of either problem or pattern?
I think America is getting more conservative for the first time in my life. Like, I think my whole life, I was used to seeing the left winning all these really important culture wars in a great way, like marriage equality, and police reform, and all this stuff's like going in the right direction. And now I think there's been so much progressive overreach that is so clearly about their own economic interest to anybody who's outside of that bubble, that Americans are really turning against that. You're going to see that in the midterms, so I think, and the thing is, like, young people grow up, like they're very, very, left when they're young, but then they grow up and they become less left. And I think that I'm hoping what happened in this generation was that, we're running out of basically rope for this meritocratic elite. So for millennials, it was like, you had to work really, really, really hard to get into one of these schools because there's only so much room at the top 10%, right? And you had to beat out, everybody else. And because working class life today is so downwardly mobile, middle class life is non-existent, right? It's like you make it to the elites or you're done, right? But I think that Gen Z, it seems to me like they have a lot less patience for this. Like, they really hate cancel culture. Their whole lives are online, and they're just sort of very impatient with the idea that somebody accidentally says the wrong word and their career should be ruined. Now, millennials are very into cancel culture because they are so careerist, and it is a form of careerism, right? To use like the actual real pain of Black Americans to further their own careers. But that's very much what you see, like at the New York Times, for example, as like a Gen X editor once said to me, imagine if the younger generation coming up both had better digital skills than you that could, wipe you out. And they'll call you racist if you say something they don't like, and you'll understand the terror that like the older generations feel. But I think that the younger generation is sort of sick of that, and their economic fortunes are so bad and so poor. I really feel like that there's, more of this sort of populist, the stuff I like, which is sort of more socially conservative, economically populist stuff, because the real social battles have been won. I mean, that's the thing that we like on the left don't like to admit, because it's to cede power, right? If you can call anybody you disagree with a homophobe or transphobe or a racist, that you're done, right? You don't really have to do much else, because those are horrible things to be. Once those battles have been fought and won, they have to increasingly come up with things because they're not willing to actually fight it out on the merits. And so I have a lot of hope for the younger generation. Although I have to say, when I go, I don't have TikTok because I'm really scared of Chinese surveillance. But when I see that those video, the amount of time they spend on it and the amount of depression and suicidal ideation, all that, it's a really sad. I feel so sorry for them.
Yeah. So I'm gonna wrap up with just one more question, which is really about, you started to talk about American Jews and really speaking about how this affects them. You're talking primarily right now to a community that is based in Boston. There are people here from different places, but largely the coastal areas that you're referring to. And I would just love to hear if you can say a little bit more about like what we should be sensitive to as if we're trying to kind of either get out of our bubbles, or if we're trying to see the world differently around the issues that we care about, the communities that we're connected to.
Don't allow yourself self-flattering caricatures of people you disagree with. That's like the number one thing, is like nobody, the bill doesn't say don't say gay, because that would be horrible. And your political opponents are not horrible. It's great news. I mean, I know, but it hurts, right? You don't want to know that. You want them to be horrible because then you're so much better than them and on the winning side. But read the bill. It doesn't say that at all. And that it's just an example, but like there's so many examples like that. Like, don't allow yourself a self-flattering view of who your opponents are, because it's not right. It's not fair. It's ungodly, but also you're hurting the very people you most want to help, because actually they agree with that bill, and actually this just lets you off the hook for, actually caring about the issues at hand. And it's so interesting, Boston, because when Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley first came into office, God, I worshiped the ground she walked on. She had this reputation that preceded her of being a compromiser, of working with Republicans, and you just see now the pressures of belonging to the squad and being in Washington. And I find that very sad. And I think that that thing of like approaching the people who are your political opponents with compassion, respect, and not allowing ourselves that self-flattering view that we're on the right side and so forth. Like, the only way back is to become one of the people who's stitching back together the fabric of American society, which means being engaged with ideas you disagree with. It hurts. It's really painful. It sucks, because especially when you change your mind, it's the worst. But that would be what I would hope. Yeah.
No, I love that note. And I think it's something I know I personally can really relate to it. And I think that your comments earlier about Trump and what was and was not published on the op-ed pages of major papers, I don't think that everyone would know or have even noticed that. And I can see how there's this implicit bias that's embedded within that. So thank you so much for really ending on a note that in many ways feels kind of uplifting, because it's something that I think we can all take and try to work on.
Totally.
I want to thank you again, Batya, for joining us this evening. Congratulations on this wonderful book of yours. And
thank you so much for having me.
Of course. In the chat, you will see one of many places where you can find Batya's book. There is a independent bookstore in Kansas City. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's an independent bookstore and wine salon in Kansas City. It's Black owned. Two Black sisters started during the pandemic. And, I know it's very easy to get things on Amazon. It's probably cheaper too. But if you want to throw your business to a small business during the pandemic, after the pandemic, I would be so grateful.
Great. So we put that into the chat. And then I also just wanted to let everybody know very quickly about 4 special events. Next week, we're going to be having a virtual author talk on Tuesday with Alyssa Friedland on her book, The Last Summer at the Golden Hotel. And then just today, if you're on our listserv, which I'm sure most of you are by now, we announced that we have 3 special in-person programs taking place this spring. On Sunday, May 15th, we have an amazing concert at the Vilna called Voices of Humanity, formerly the Voices of Freedom concert. It's an interfaith concert with 3 prestigious Boston area choirs who will be playing Jewish, Muslim, and Christian music. So really very much to try and bring people together. Then on Tuesday, May 24th, we're going to be having 2 authors come to be in discussion with one another. Their talk is called Coming of Age. It's 2 women who were in a writing group together and really were on the journey of writing their first book at the same time. They both are coming out this season. And then last but not least, on Tuesday, June 7th, we have an author talk again in our office at the Vilna, with Dara Horn, the author of People Love Dead Jews. It's an incredible book. She will be in discussion with Shira Goodman, who is CJP's chair of their board of directors and the former CEO of Staples, and a real leader in our community. Both of those author talks will begin with a beautiful reception. There'll be wine and cheese on our patio, and then we'll come inside. So if you haven't been out in 2 years, come out on May 15th, May 24th, or June 7th. And you will see me and so many other people who are with us online in person. And with that, I wish you all a wonderful evening. And if you are celebrating Passover or Easter in the coming weeks, I just want to wish you all a happy holiday as we enter into a new holiday season. Bye, everyone. Good evening.